Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Max Verstappen has denied claims from Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes that the Red Bull RB19 is the most dominant car we have seen in recent Formula 1 memory. He says by the numbers, the Mercedes in the early turbo hybrid days is certainly clear, but do the numbers back up this claim? Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it guys. Firstly, loads of updates around the Formula 1 world, largely on the calendar. Rumours circulating and for understandable reasons. He's at it again. Stefano Domenicali wants to push up the number of races next year to 25. This, I think, for some time has been expected. I think he's even mentioned that there could be appetite for 35, 40 Grand Prix around the world if they had the time to do it. They don't, it's not going to happen. But yeah, he may well try and push beyond 25 in the future, and that's been considered realistically the upper limit of what is possible for some time. But yeah, 25 next year. This year, in fairness, is meant to be 24, but there's no China. If that happens next year with another one coming in, it maybe isn't a massive surprise. However, next year we might get the South African Grand Prix. That is the present rumour as to the additional race on the calendar, returning to Kyalami for the first time in some time, as long as it requires the appropriate FIA approval. There's also talk, though, about Vietnam. If you guys aren't familiar, back in 2020, we were going to go to Vietnam for the Vietnamese Grand Prix in Hanoi, but it never happened because the pandemic struck, of course. So we never raced at this circuit, but it was added to F1 2020, and, you know, there were some fans of it. I'm not a massive fan personally, but here was the circuit. The rumour has it that if they are going to go back to Vietnam at some point in the future, they will take some parts of this track and expand it with other parts. So, you know, it won't be exactly this circuit if they are going to go back to Vietnam, or, you know, that's not planned at the moment, but apparently there is interest in doing exactly that. So it's tricky to predict what's going to happen in the future, but everyone wants in right now onto the Formula 1 calendar, it seems, especially the street circuits, which is what it is. On the more positive side, the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa say they are much more confident and much more optimistic. They can sort out a new contract. The only circuit in Formula 1 right now with no contract for next year. That's pretty concerning, but they say they can come to a deal. There were discussions roughly this time last year that Spa was in doubt for the future, and it better not be gone for like a, you know, Hanoi street circuit or something. I wouldn't be happy with that. The other big story, though, is around the sprint race structure. If you guys haven't been following the news over the last few days, they are trying, and the teams have agreed to change the sprint race weekend format to go from, as it is now, practice and then quali on Friday. The quali is for the sprint race on Saturday. That happens after a useless FP2 session on Saturday morning or early afternoon, and then the sprint happens. Then on Sunday it's the race. They're changing it so that the qualifying session on Friday sets the grid for Sunday, and the sprint day on Saturday is a separate qualifying session for the sprints, and then the sprint itself, which is just for points and doesn't set the order for the Grand Prix on Sunday. I think that's marginally better. The issue that Pirelli have, though, is that for that extra qualifying session, they need to supply extra tyres, and there might not be the chance to do so. Many parties are on holiday while Pirelli faces a race, so the teams apparently have agreed to delay the revised sprint format until Austria in July, rather than doing it in Baku instead. So Baku will have the traditional format where it's going to go as sprint races have done in the past, which is maybe good, maybe bad. We'll see. Christian Horner isn't happy because of the potential incident damage that could occur, especially, as he said, in a cost cap era, which, you know, Red Bull love to respect the cost cap, of course. The other talk on the cost cap is from Gunther Steiner. Latest words coming out of him about why exactly they fired Mick Schumacher. Now, in retrospect, this has been an intelligent move. They brought in Nico Hülkenberg, who's done a stellar job, but, you know, in fairness, Kevin Magnussen smashed it into the wall for no reason, it seems, in Australia, which obviously hasn't helped them either. But Mick Schumacher did have his fair number of crashes last year in Saudi Arabia, in Monaco, which is this one, and also, of course, in Suzuka, saying that Mick Schumacher cost the team $2 million last year. The single crash during the in-lap at Suzuka, admittedly in the wet, kind of tricky conditions, cost them $700,000, and that probably really was the nail in the coffin for his time at Haas. No one else managed to right of a car where they were driving back to the pits, he says. We lose a car after 5 minutes and now have to rebuild another. I cannot have a driver who I am not confident can take a car safely on a slow lap. It's just ridiculous. How many people could we employ for $700,000? So maybe fair enough. And in hindsight, it's been proved to be the correct decision, really, with how Hülkenberg has performed so far. A weird update as well from Charles Leclerc here. I kind of of can't believe that people actually do this. But as Leclerc says, his address has somehow become public, and people just turn up to his apartment, ring his doorbell, and ask for pictures and autographs. I can't imagine the audacity of people to just rock up to someone's private accommodation and be like, hey, can I get an autograph, please? So he says, look, please respect my privacy and no longer do this. I won't be answering the door if that happens. This is a boundary that shouldn't be crossed, which is totally, yeah, I totally agree with this. There was even some drama that like some journalist went up to Checo Perez wanting an autograph or a picture of him and his son, and Perez declines because, you know, he was busy doing his own thing, living his own life and wanting to be private in that way. And then the journalist got all annoyed about it, and then people roasted the journalist, and then he backed down. So I don't know what's getting into people, to be honest. The entitlement is kind of crazy. But let's dive into this battle that we had very briefly, admittedly, at the Australian Grand Prix. Verstappen, once he was past Hamilton, and the way he passed Hamilton with the DRS was pretty outrageous, and he was off and into the distance. Hamilton was probably 2 seconds back by the start-finish line. Part of that was Hamilton dropping back deliberately to protect his tyres. Some of that was the Red Bull RB19 being absolutely rapid, especially with the DRS open. Now, we've had many statements coming out of especially Mercedes, and you can understand why, given their pedigree over the last decade, let's say in Formula 1, about the Red Bull RB19 and how good it is compared to the competition. Russell said after Bahrain that they would win every race this season. In fairness, so far they've gone 3 for 3. I don't expect them to go 23 for 23, but you know, you wouldn't rule it out. It's still possible. Helmut Marko said at the time, no, that's not going to happen. This statement by Russell can perhaps be explained by the frustration of the Bahrain Grand Prix, which maybe is fair enough. But then George Russell, even after Australia, said they are sandbagging to avoid rule changes. They're deliberately not going as fast as they could. Even Verstappen commented on this quote from Russell and said, well, I could probably have pushed another half a second out of that car, which would have put them to the 0.7 of a second advantage the Russell feels like they presently have. Now, of course, it's not the only time in Formula 1 history that teams have deliberately held back a little bit to try and show their advantages less than it actually is, to protect the advantage they have, and to not force the hand of the rule makers to potentially make changes. So I think Russell and Verstappen are probably both right here. And of course, there was tyre saving going on, and you never know if there's a late safety car. You don't want to push too hard because then you're going to eat up your tyres if that was to be the eventuality. Horner commented on this and said, very generous of him, right? Very generous of Russell to say this. He'd know too well from his team about those kind of advantages. And we discussed this comment the other day, and we showed evidence that there were Mercedes engineers back in 2014, 2015, 2016 that very rarely ran the car at maximum power in qualifying because their car was so good aerodynamically and they had the fastest engine by a mile. They probably gained like a second a lap on their opposition at times if they run their engine at full power at the peak of the Mercedes dominance. And they deliberately would back off a bit to try and not pretend they were as good as they actually were. So Mercedes have definitely done this in the past, but to be fair, a lot of their advantage back then was engine related. Now the advantage Red Bull have is pretty much aerodynamic related entirely, I would say. I think the engines are relatively similar across the top teams, which fundamentally is incredibly impressive what Red Bull have been able to accomplish. And we know that Mercedes are like, look, we've just got to straight up do a better job. But Hamilton said after, I believe it was Saudi Arabia, when he was passed in a straight line by Verstappen, and it happened again, of course, in Australia, he says, look, I don't know if it's for me to say, but I've never seen a car that fast. When we were fast, we weren't that fast. That's the fastest car I've ever seen compared to the rest. Now, whether he was discussing the pure speed difference, as in the speed of the Red Bull with DRS compared to the Mercedes, or whether he was discussing pure lap time, is a little bit unclear. But nonetheless, this comment was interpreted to mean that Hamilton says that compared to the opposition, the RB19 is the strongest car ever. Now, okay, you can look at the 2002 Ferrari, you can look at the 2014 Mercedes. Those are other candidates here, and even further back than that, there's other examples as well. But it's certainly not far off, I don't think, and there is a debate to be had. Now, Verstappen disagrees. He says if you look at the statistics, that statement is not correct. We have a very good car. He's not, of course, denying it. There's nothing wrong with that. Yet we are not as dominant as Mercedes have shown in some years. Specifically, I would say, 14, 15, 16, the early days before the 2017 rule changes happened that pegged them back a little bit. They still won the championships after that. In 2020, the W11 was like something from another planet. But those early days, they did have a mega advantage. Verstappen also went on to say, I don't spend too much time with that, i.e. thinking about those comments, but it won't help you either. Pretty much saying that Hamilton complaining about how fast our car is isn't going to make his car go any quicker. Whatever we have done in the 8 years that Mercedes was so dominant, we also try to close the gap. That's all you can do. So giving Mercedes some advice on what they should try. But these are the actual numbers, right? So this is comparing Bahrain over the last decade. And in Bahrain 2014, the Mercedes was far quicker than everyone else, we're talking over a second a lap. The Red Bull in 2023 was the most dominant car we've seen at Bahrain since then, 7 cents a lap. This, of course, is race pace. If you look at the average across quali and the race, then the Red Bull looks pegged back a bit because they're not as good in quali as they are in the race. But fundamentally, especially with the new regs where it's easier to overtake, the race pace is just by far the most important factor. Last year, Ferrari were quicker on average in qualifying the Red Bull, but especially at the end of the season, were dwarfed by Red Bull in race pace. However, if you take a different approach and average out the first 2 races of the season, you'll find that it's actually the Red Bull RB19 that is the strongest over the last decade. If you then consider this compared to the 3rd race included on Australia, then it swings back the way of the Mercedes in 2014 because the Red Bull only had technically roughly a 0.3 of a second race pace advantage in Australia, but I would say there was other factors in play, and it was probably the worst the Red Bull is ever going to be realistically compared to their opposition, given the strength and the weaknesses of that car, and we'll discuss that just quickly in a second here. So what do you guys think about this? By the numbers, we simply need more time to say. 3 races in isn't enough time to really give an accurate representation, but I think Mercedes have a point that the RB19 is definitely up there in terms of race pace advantage over the field, which is fundamentally what matters. The RB19 is up there with the very best cars Mercedes have ever produced. Whether that will maintain over the season to put it in a similar category, that's a question. But last season, by win percentage, 17 of 22, that was one of the most dominant seasons ever. And I guess part of that was Ferrari messing up the strategy early on, but towards the end, that was pure pace in the Red Bull. And, this season is looking to be even better than that. I did mention the other day exactly why their advantage arrives in the race compared to qualifying, and we discussed the anti-dive suspension geometry. And F1 Data Analysis here did an interesting thread explaining what that is and exactly how it is created. You can imagine here that if you brake with a bike, it's going to pitch down to a certain extent. This also happens with a Formula 1 car, and you can set up your suspension with these wishbones to prevent that from happening. This means in qualifying, it's more difficult to switch on the front tyres and the rear tyres as well by having an anti-dive and anti-squat setup, but it does mean in the race you can run your car far flatter, generate more downforce, have a more effective DRS, and this does seem to be one of the tricks to what Red Bull are currently able to achieve. So unless other teams can potentially replicate this idea and eliminate some of the downsides as Red Bull have, I think downsides that were exacerbated in Australia, and I would expect to be amplified the other way in Baku, right? So I think we're going to have a few more races here. Baku, for example, other potentially strong Red Bull circuits like Monza, before we get a really good picture as to what this season is looking like and how good the RB19 is compared to some of its predecessors. But both sides of the argument presently have merit. Very much intrigued your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.